52 BC. The night air in central Gaul is not just cold. It is a physical weight pressing down on your lungs, thick with the smell of wet earth and impending death. You are crawling through the freezing mud, a messenger attempting the impossible escape from a besieged fortress. The darkness is absolute, a heavy shroud that hides the horizon. Ahead, the grass looks flat, a deceptive invitation to run. You push yourself up, your muscles screaming for malnutrition, and you commit to the sprint. You take one step, then another, your eyes straining against the gloom. Suddenly, the solid earth betrays you. There is no sound of a tripwire, no click of mechanism, just a terrifying sensation of the ground vanishing beneath your feet. Your leg plunges into a void, and a sickening, wet crack reverberates through your entire skeleton. You have not simply twisted an ankle in a gopher hole. You have stepped into a lily. This is a Roman engineering nightmare. A funnel-shaped pit dug with mathematical precision, concealing a fire-hardened oak stake buried at the bottom. The wood, treated to be as hard as iron, drives upward, designed specifically to shatter the shin bone of anyone foolish enough to move rapidly. Pain detonates in your leg, a blinding white light behind your eyes that drowns out the world. You act on pure animal instinct, clawing at the mud, trying to pull your mangled limb free, but the pit is shaped like a hook. The more you struggle, the tighter the earth grips your broken leg. You are anchored to your own agony. 50 yards away, through the mist, you hear the rhythmic metallic clatter of armor. A Roman centurion is breathing calmly in the dark. He does not need to draw his gladius. He does not need to raise his shield. The dirt has already defeated you. This is the terrifying, visceral reality of the Siege of Alesia. It is not a war of heroic duels and flashing swords. It is a slaughter conducted by shovel, starvation, and the ruthless application of geometry. Before we dissect the brutal genius behind these traps and the mind of the man who ordered them, if you appreciate uncovering the gritty, tactile realities of the past, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. Do you believe that wars are won by engineering or by courage? I read every response in the comments, and I want to know where you stand. In the sweltering summer of 52 BC, Julius Caesar found himself staring at a tactical impossibility. He was deep in hostile territory, isolated from Rome, and his legendary career was hanging by a single, fraying thread. Confronting him was Vercingetorix, the king of the Gauls, a leader who had achieved the unthinkable by uniting the fractured tribes into a singular hammer war. Vercingetorix sat securely atop the massive plateau of Alesia, surrounded by 80,000 warriors who worshipped the ground he walked on. The Gallic king held every card in the deck. He possessed the high ground, a natural fortress of rock that dominated the valley. He had the supplies to outlast the season. He had the overwhelming numbers. He fully expected Caesar to launch a desperate, bloody assault up the steep slopes, a suicide mission that would see the Roman legions broken against the rocks and Gallic spears. But Caesar did not attack. He stood in the valley, looking up at the mountain fortress, and decided to rewrite the laws of warfare. He ordered his 50,000 legionaries to ground their shields and pick up their shovels. If he could not defeat Vercingetorix in a fair fight, he would simply delete the battlefield from existence. The Romans began a construction project of maniacal proportions, a feat of labor that defies modern comprehension. They encircled the entire hill with an 11-mile ring of fortifications. But to call them walls is an insult to the horror they represented. They were a complex death zone of trenches, diverted rivers, and those horrific hidden traps. Caesar was not just building a fence to keep people in. He was building a machine designed to grind the Gallic spirit into dust. Vercingetorix, watching from the high walls of Alesia, realized the nature of the trap only when the first timber pylons were already set. He saw the Roman noose tightening around the throat of his army and played his only remaining card. Before the circle closed completely, he launched his cavalry through a weak point in the unfinished lines. Their mission was not to fight, but to run, to ride to the four corners of Gaul and summon a massive relief army, a force of over 250,000 men, to crush Caesar from behind. Caesar watched them escape into the twilight. He knew exactly what it meant. The clock was ticking. He knew a tidal wave of enemies was gathering to wipe him off the map. Most commanders would have retreated, cutting their losses to save their army. Caesar instead did something that borders on insanity. He ordered his men to turn their backs to Alesia and build a second wall, this time facing outward. The Romans were now effectively trapping themselves inside a donut of fortifications, waiting to be attacked by 80,000 desperate men from the inside and 250,000 furious warriors from the outside. The hunter had voluntarily locked himself in a cage to become the prey. To understand the magnitude of the disaster unfolding at Alesia, we must first understand the man standing on the ramparts. Vercingetorix was an anomaly in the chaotic tribal landscape of Gaul. Before him, the Gallic tribes were their own worst enemies, constantly bickering, raiding each other's livestock, and selling their neighbors out to Rome for a handful of silver coins. Vercingetorix changed the equation. He was a nobleman of the Arverni tribe, and he possessed a rare combination of political charisma and ruthless military discipline. He forged a coalition through blood and iron, famously disciplining wavering chieftains by cutting off their ears or gouging out their eyes to ensure loyalty. He demanded absolute unity because he knew exactly what was coming for them. By 52 BC, the Gallic Wars had dragged on for 6 brutal years. The Roman machine seemed unstoppable, a grinder that consumed nations. But just months before Alesia, something unprecedented happened. The machine broke. The site was Gergovia, another hilltop fortress much like Alesia. There, Caesar had attempted to crush the rebellion with his standard tactic, aggression. He tried to storm the heights, assuming the barbarians would shatter under the discipline of the legions. He was wrong. Vercingetorix used the high ground effectively, bottling the Romans up and launching counterattacks that threw the legions into confusion. For the first time, the invincible Julius Caesar was beaten. He lost nearly 700 men, including 46 centurions, the backbone of his army. The Romans were forced to withdraw in disgrace, leaving their dead on the slopes. This victory sent a shock wave through the ancient world. It proved that Caesar was human. It proved that Rome could bleed. And most dangerously, it convinced Vercingetorix that it found the formula to defeat the empire: refuse open battle, retreat to a fortified hill, cut off Roman supply lines, and let the legions break themselves against the walls. This success at Gergovia became the architect of Vercingetorix's doom at Alesia. When the Roman legions began to pursue him again later that summer, the Gallic king didn't flee into the deep forests or scatter his army to conduct guerrilla warfare. He looked at the map and saw Alesia. It was Gergovia all over again, but better. The plateau was larger, the walls were higher, and the water supply was abundant. He believed he was setting the same trap that had worked before. He would lure Caesar in, let the Romans exhaust themselves in futile assaults, and then crush them. Vercingetorix marched his 80,000 warriors onto the Mandubii plateau with his head held high. He brought in the local population. He stocked the granaries. He prepared for a glorious defensive battle. He looked down at the valley and waited for Caesar to make the same mistake he made at Gergovia. But he failed to account for the adaptability of his enemy. Caesar was a man who learned from his scars. The humiliation at Gergovia had burned away any arrogance the Roman general might have had regarding siege assaults. Caesar looked at Alesia and immediately recognized that storming the walls would be a massacre for his men. He likely saw the ghosts of his dead centurions from Gergovia, warning him against a direct attack. So when Vercingetorix looked down for the walls on that first day, expecting to see scaling ladders and battering rams, he saw something infinitely more terrifying. He saw surveyors. He saw engineers driving stakes into the ground to measure distances. He saw the legions laying out the perimeter for a wall of their own. Caesar had changed the game. He wasn't going to fight Vercingetorix. He was going to ignore him. The psychological impact on the Gallic forces cannot be overstated. These were warriors raised on a culture of individual bravery and single combat. They wanted to charge, to clash swords, to scream their war cries. Instead, they were forced to watch the Romans dig ditches. Day after day, the Roman line tightened like a constrictor snake. There were no glorious charges to repel. There were no enemies to kill. There was only the sound of 50,000 shovels moving earth, constructing a prison that would starve them to death. Vercingetorix realized his miscalculation too late. The strategy that won Gergovia was useless here, because Caesar refused to play his part in the script. The king of the Gauls had locked himself in a cage, handed the key to his enemy, and challenged him to a fight. Caesar simply locked the door and walked away to build a wall. The trap at Gergovia had relied on Roman aggression. The trap at Alesia relied on Roman patience, and Caesar, with his career on the line, had all the patience in the world. The order moves down the line. 50,000 shields are stacked. 50,000 pila are planted in the earth. In their place, the legions draw their delabra, the heavy pickaxe-matic that is as much a symbol of Roman power as the eagle standard. The tactics here are ruthless in their simplicity. If you cannot kill the enemy with steel, you bury him with dirt. The work begins with a speed that defies belief. These men are not just soldiers. They are the finest construction crews in the ancient world. Within hours, the Green Valley floor is ripped open. The first incision is a massive trench, 20 feet wide, dug specifically at the base of the hill. Caesar orders the walls of this trench to be vertical, not sloped. He wants a tank trap, a sheer drop designed to shatter the legs of any horse that attempts to jump it. This is the stopping line, a physical barrier to prevent Vercingetorix's cavalry from rushing the Roman workers behind it. Inside Alesia, the mood shifts from mockery to alarm. Vercingetorix sees the brown scar of the earthworks lengthening by the hour. He knows he cannot let the Romans finish this noose. He orders his cavalry, the elite nobility of the Gallic tribes, to saddle up. They thunder down the slopes, aiming to butcher the legionaries while they are waist-deep in the mud. This is the first true test of the siege. A chaotic, swirling melee erupts in the space between the hill and the trenches. Roman workers drop their shovels, grab their shields, and form tight defensive knots. But Caesar has anticipated this. He unleashes his own secret weapon, Germanic cavalry. These are mercenaries hired from across the Rhine, savage horsemen who ride alongside the legions. They crash into the Gallic charge with ferocity. The skirmish is bloody and desperate, fought in the shadow of the rising walls. The Gauls are driven back, leaving their dead in the very ditches the Romans are digging. But the raid reveals a terrifying truth to Vercingetorix. The Roman line is solidifying. Once the main wall is finished, his cavalry, his fastest units, will be useless. They will be trapped inside, eating food that his infantry needs. He makes a fateful decision, under the cover of a moonless night. Before the Roman ring is fully closed, Vercingetorix orders his entire cavalry force to break out. It is a gamble of supreme stakes. Thousands of horsemen silently pick their way through a gap in the unfinished Roman lines. They slip past the sleeping sentries and gallop into the darkness. Their orders are simple. Ride. Ride to every tribe in Gaul. Tell them their king is trapped. Tell them to bring every able-bodied man who can hold a spear. Come back and crush Caesar. Caesar wakes to the news at dawn. The birds have flown. He looks at the tracks leading away from Alesia and immediately understands the implications. The clock has started. The Roman legion is no longer just besieging a city. They are now the target of a massive rescue operation. The hunters are about to be hunted. Most commanders would panic. They would see the vulnerability of their position, exposed in open country, waiting for 250,000 angry Gauls to arrive. Caesar does not panic. He calls for his engineers. He points to the empty field behind his army, away from Alesia. We have walled them in. He might have said, now we must wall them out. The plan is expanded. The legions will not stop digging. They will build a second line of fortifications facing outward, creating a massive fortified donut. The army will live, sleep, and fight in the narrow strip between these two walls. It is a tactical insanity, a feat of engineering hubris that has no parallel in history. The soldiers groan, their hands blistered, their backs aching. But they dig. They know that when the relief army arrives, these walls will be the only thing standing between them and annihilation. The cage is snapped shut, but now Caesar must reinforce the bars before the storm hits. Let's take a walk through the kill zone. If you were a Gallic warrior trying to attack the Roman lines, you wouldn't just run into a wall. You would have to navigate a meticulously designed obstacle course of death. This is a contravallation, the inner ring facing Vercingetorix, and it remains one of the most brutal examples of military engineering ever conceived. First, you face the trenches, not just one, but two parallel ditches, each 15 feet wide and just as deep. The inner one is filled with water diverted from the local rivers, creating a stagnant, muddy moat. If you manage to swim across that, you face the rampart itself, a 12-foot-high wall of packed earth topped with a palisade and battlements. But the wall isn't just wood and dirt. It is bristling with Valerie, sharp wooden stakes projecting horizontally to prevent anyone from climbing over. Every 80 feet, a 3-story wooden tower looms over you, manned by archers and scorpion artillery crews. But the true genius and cruelty of Caesar's design lies in what sits in front of the trenches. Caesar knew he was outnumbered. He couldn't man every inch of the wall at all times. So he built automated defenses. He turned the landscape into a minefield that didn't need gunpowder. Closest to the wall, we find the Stimuli. These are massive tree trunks buried deep in the ground with their heavy branches sharpened into points and interlaced. They look like the antlers of a giant stag. They're designed to hold you in place, to tangle your formation so the Roman archers on the wall can pick you off at their leisure. If you survive the Stimuli, you step into the field of lilies, which we encountered earlier. 8 rows of these funnel pits arranged in a checkerboard pattern. But there is more. Buried in the grass, ahead of the lilies, are the Stimuli. These are the most insidious of all. They are simple blocks of wood with iron-barbed hooks driven into them, buried entirely underground with only the hook protruding slightly above the soil. Think of them as ancient landmines. You can't see them. You step on one, and the hook drives into the sole of your foot. When you instinctively pull your leg up, the barb tears through nerves and muscle. A warrior crippled by a stimulus isn't dead. He is screaming, writhing on the ground, becoming an obstacle to the men behind him, and a drain on the morale of his entire unit. Caesar's men planted thousands of these. They created a no-man's land roughly 400 yards wide. This was not a fair fight. It was a meat grinder. The Romans called these traps by innocent names. Lilies because they look like flowers. Sippi meaning grave markers. It was a dark, soldierly humor. Inside the fortifications, the legionaries worked with the precision of clockmakers. They weren't just digging. They were manufacturing a landscape of terror. Every stake was sharpened to a needle point and fire-hardened to prevent rot and increase hardness. Every trench was measured perfectly. They moved millions of cubic feet of earth, not with machinery, but with baskets of muscle fueled by vinegar, water, and grain. For the Gauls watching from the heights, the psychological impact was devastating. They saw their sacred land being mutilated, turned against them. They realized that to reach the Romans, they would have to wade through a sea of hidden blades. Caesar had effectively told them, "Come and get me, but you will bleed before you even see the whites of my eyes." By the time the second wall, the circumvallation facing outward, was completed, the Romans had constructed a total of nearly 25 miles of fortifications. They had enclosed themselves in a fortress of their own making. The stage was set. The machine was built. Now it just needed to be fed. While the inner wall suffocated Vercingetorix, a new threat was growing on the horizon. The Gallic cavalry had done their job. The call to arms had spread like wildfire across the forests of Gaul, from the foggy coast of Armorica to the mountains of the Arverni. Tribes that had been rivals for centuries put aside their blood feuds. They united for a single purpose: to crush the Roman invader. A massive relief army estimated by Caesar at 250,000 men, though modern historians suggest a still staggering 100,000, began the march toward Alesia. Caesar was now in a race against physics. He had to finish a second wall before this tidal wave crashed into his rear. This was the circumvallation. If the inner wall was a prison, the outer wall was a fortress. It stretched for 14 miles, encompassing the entire Roman operation. The legionaries were now living in a thin strip of land between two hostile perimeters. Imagine a long fortified hallway wrapping around a mountain. Inside this hallway lived 50,000 men, thousands of horses, and all their supplies. They were the besiegers, yet they were also the besieged. The psychological strain of this position was unique. Usually, a besieging army sits comfortably in the countryside, raiding farms and sleeping securely. Here, the Romans were trapped. They had to forage for food and water in a shrinking territory. Every foraging party sent out was a gamble. If they strayed too far, they would be picked off by Gallic scouts. If they stayed too close, they would starve. Caesar ordered the same deadly jewelry to be installed on the outer wall. The trenches, the Scipi, the Stimuli. He effectively created a two-front war where the fronts were back-to-back. A Roman soldier standing on the ramparts could look over his left shoulder and see Vercingetorix's starving troops, and look over his right shoulder to see the dust cloud of the approaching relief army. Vercingetorix, from his high perch, could see the second wall rising. It must have been a bittersweet sight. On one hand, it confirmed that help was coming. Why else would Caesar build it? On the other hand, it meant that the relief army wouldn't just be marching into a battle. They would be marching into a meat grinder. The king of the Gauls had hoped for a hammer and anvil strike, smashing the Romans against his hill. Instead, Caesar had built a shield that faced both ways. Within the Roman camp, discipline became the only religion. Mark Antony and Gaius Trebonius, Caesar's lieutenants, rode the length of the lines, checking defenses. They knew that once the attack started, there would be no reinforcements. There was no Rome to call for help. If the outer wall breached, they would be slaughtered. If the inner wall breached, they would be slaughtered. The genius of the circumvallation was not just in its height or thickness, but in its denial of momentum. The incoming Gallic relief army would be tired from the march. They would have to cross the zone of death under fire, breach the wall, and then fight fresh Roman legionaries. And even if they broke through, they would find themselves in a killing box wedged between the two walls. As the days turned into weeks, the silence grew heavy. The construction noise faded. The walls were finished. The traps were set. The Roman army waited in their fortified donut, listening to the wind, checking their pila, and watching the horizon. They were 50,000 men alone in a hostile nation, encased in wood and earth, waiting for the world to end. Inside the walls of Alesia, the enemy was no longer the Romans. It was time. Vercingetorix had calculated his supplies for 30 days. 30 days had passed. The relief army was nowhere to be seen. The grain silos were empty. The cattle had been slaughtered. Panic began to replace discipline. The Gallic council met in a grim atmosphere. Some chieftains suggested surrender. Others, like the Arvernian noble Cartaginatus, proposed a horrific solution: cannibalism. He argued that they should eat those too old or too weak to fight to sustain the warriors. Why not? He might have asked. We are fighting for freedom. Vercingetorix rejected cannibalism, but his alternative was hardly more humane. He decided to purge the city of useless mouths. This meant the elderly, the sick, the women, and the children. Most tragic of all, these were not strangers. These were the Mandubii, the local tribe who had owned this town, who had opened their gates to Vercingetorix and welcomed his army. Now, in return for their hospitality, they were being evicted from their own homes. The gates of Alesia creaked open. Thousands of Mandubii civilians shuffled out, carrying their meager possessions, moving down the slope toward the Roman lines. They wept, but there was a flicker of hope. They believed that Caesar, a representative of civilized Rome, would take pity on them. They expected to be taken as slaves. A terrible fate, but better than starvation. At the very least, they thought he would let them pass through the lines to the countryside. They reached the Roman trenches and looked up at the legionaries on the ramparts. They begged for bread. They begged for slavery. Caesar looked down from his fortifications. His decision was instantaneous and icy. He was not running a charity. He was running a siege. Every mouth he fed was a day's rations taken from his soldiers. If he let them pass, he would lose the psychological leverage over Vercingetorix. He wanted the king of the Gauls to watch his own people suffer. Caesar ordered the gates to remain barred. The Mandubii turned back to Alesia, screaming for Vercingetorix to let them return. But the Gallic king, steeling himself for battle to come, refused to open the gates. He could not afford to feed them. And so, the Mandubii were trapped in the no-man's land between the two armies. The starvation tactics employed here reached a level of cruelty that is hard to stomach, even 2,000 years later. For days, the civilians wandered the killing fields. They ate the grass. They gnawed on leather and bark. Wives held up their starving infants to the walls, pleading with their husbands inside the city and the Romans outside. Both sides watched. The Roman legionaries, hardened men who had seen everything, had to stand guard and listen to the slow, agonizing death of thousands of innocents just yards away. The Gauls on the walls had to watch their families wither and die in the mud. It was a psychological torture designed to break the will of the defenders, but it also hardened the hearts of the Romans. By the time the relief army finally arrived, the cries from the ditch had largely stopped. The Mandubii were gone, reduced to corpses littering the obstacle course of Caesar's traps. This mass death served as a gruesome prelude to the final battle. It stripped away any illusion of honor. There was no chivalry left at Alesia. There was only the raw biological imperative to survive at any cost. The silence of the dead was finally broken, not by screams, but by the rumble of the earth. On the horizon, the standards of the relief army finally appeared. The cavalry arrived first, followed by a sea of infantry. The outer wall was about to be tested. The starving men inside Alesia heard the commotion and grabbed their weapons with shaking hands. The waiting was over. The apocalypse had arrived. The relief army, commanded by Commius and Vercingetorix's cousin, Vercingetorix, spilled into the plain like a landslide. Caesar estimated their numbers at 250,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Even if modern historians trimmed those numbers, the Roman legionaries were staring at a force 4 times their size. The ground physically vibrated. The shouting of the warriors, the beating of shields, and the blaring of the carnix, the terrifying Celtic war trumpets, created a wall of sound that drowned out orders. This was a defining moment of the Battle of Alesia. The trap was fully activated. Vercingetorix, watching from the citadel, saw the signal fire. He ordered his starving troops to throw open the gates. They didn't march out. They poured out carrying ladders, hurdles to cover the trenches, and a desperate famine-fueled rage. For the Roman soldier, the nightmare had become reality. A legionary on the wall would fire his pilum at the charging relief army, turn 180 degrees, and draw his gladius to hack at Vercingetorix's men climbing up from the inside. The thin strip of land between the two walls became a pressure cooker. The first assault was a test of the engineering. The Gallic relief army charged blindly into the kill zone we described earlier. The results were horrific. Horses impaled themselves on the hidden stakes. Waves of warriors fell into the lilies, their legs snapping like dry twigs, only to be trampled by the waves of men behind them. The Roman scorpions, giant sniper crossbows, punched holes through the dense Gallic ranks. But the Gauls had numbers. They threw bundles of brushwood into the trenches to create bridges. They tossed earth over the hidden spikes. They were paving a road with their own equipment and their own dead. Caesar stood at a high vantage point, arguably the busiest man in the ancient world. He wasn't fighting. He was conducting. He watched for flags, listened for trumpets, and shifted his cohorts like chess pieces. Wherever the line buckled, he sent reserves. The Gallic wars had produced an army that could move with fluid precision, even in total chaos. Nightfall brought no relief. Under the cover of darkness, the relief army launched a second massive wave. They brought grappling hooks and siege engines. The Romans, unable to see the enemy, threw their heavy pila blindly into the dark, aiming at the roar of the crowd. The screams of men pierced by the heavy javelins echoed through the valley. Inside the donut, the pressure was reaching a breaking point. Vercingetorix's men were tearing at the inner wall, filling the moat with clay and fascines.